His Grace was born in 1948 in Burbank, California, and was raised attending St. Innocent's Church in Tarzana, California. He studied at the University of California at Berkeley, where he received a BA in English. And then he earned his Master's of Divinity at St. Vladimir Seminary, and then spent 7 years in doctoral studies at Oxford University, where he earned his doctorate in 1980. It was through that venerable institution that he wrote his dissertation on St. Dionysius the Areopagite. And this was written under the direction of the well-received and well-beloved Bishop Callistos, now Metropolitan Callistos. Toward the end of his doctoral studies, Bishop Alexander spent a year at the Simonos Petras monastery on Mount Athos, becoming a disciple of Elder Emilianos, a man with deep devotion and single-minded dedication to the revitalization of monastic life. Back in the United States, His Grace was ordained to the diaconate in 1982 and the priesthood in 1984. He received monastic tonsure from Elder Emilianos of the Simonos Petras monastery in 1986, and eventually was elevated to the rank of igumen. On October 4th, 2011, the members of the Holy Synod of Bishops of the Orthodox Church in America elected Father Alexander to be the Bishop of the Bulgarian Diocese and raised him to the rank of archimandrite at that time. Bishop Alexander is a noted scholar, which is why we are further blessed to have him with us tonight. Along with Father Michael Procurat, he established an Orthodox scholarly presence in Berkeley, California, which has become the Patriarch Athenagoras Orthodox Institute, and provides the first accredited graduate program in Orthodox theology in the U.S. that is not offered by any seminary. From 1989 until 2012, he taught patristics at Marquette University and eventually became a full professor there. His research concerns are various, and they serve to enlighten the foundations of the Christian life. He has studied the beginnings of the Christian mystical and ascetical traditions and their subsequent developments in the Greek and Syriac-speaking East. Through these studies, he developed a particular interest in continuities and parallels with Second Temple Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism. His work on the Christian ascetical and mystical tradition attracted a number of doctoral students from all over the world, with whom he began the Theophania School, an ongoing project that studies the ascetical foundations of the Orthodox faith. Bishop Alexander has always been active in missionary work, something that is near and dear to the Orthodox Christians here in Ithaca and Lansing. He has assisted the OCF at Marquette, and on Saturday, May 5th, 2012, he was consecrated to the episcopacy with these words. He said right before that happened, "When standing before the holy altar at the anaphora, the bishop images forth the one and unique high priest, Christ, who acts through his celebrant. While it is true that our Lord Jesus is true God and true King, it is also true that he did not come to us, his creatures, with pomp and splendor of the King, attended by the legions of heavens, but rather in humility he emptied himself, and he was found in the likeness of a servant." These are very different images, His Grace continued. The first set revelatory of the splendor of heaven, and the second of the humility, long-suffering, and charity of our Lord's life and ministry. My actions, my patterns of speech, my service, in short, is to be determined by the example given us by God, the Word himself. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome to our community a faithful teacher that brings wisdom and the richness of Christian history, not only as an academic pursuit, but as a way of life that can lead to a deeper love of Jesus Christ. Welcome, Your Grace, to Cornell University, to Holy Apostles Church, and we are most thankful that you are spending this evening with us. Thank you.
I was told 45 minutes to an hour, so I'll try not to keep you beyond that. And I gather I hadn't given Father James a topic, but I thought it would be along the lines of the work that he mentioned on Dionysius the Areopagite, in connection particularly with that year that you mentioned I spent on Mount Athos at the monastery of Father Emilianos. Because it was that year and that man who gave me my key to the reading of this ancient writer. So this talk will be necessarily both, well, there will be some scholarly elements. The professor has gone to the bone in me, and so it will it will come out, but as well an autobiographical element. Because in a way, you could say that my trip to the heart of the Areopagitica was a kind of life pilgrimage. A pilgrimage which indeed has shaped my life ever since. Now, let's begin with a word on Dionysius. This is the Paulist Press translation of his works with a perfectly horrible dust jacket. They've gotten much better in more recent years. They have icons now for church fathers, but they were still in a sort of, I don't know what you would call it, experimental mode when they decided on this. And as you see, it's not a very big book. This is the entirety of the Dionysian writings. And the name Dionysius comes to us from the book of Acts, chapter 19, St. Paul's singularly unsuccessful missionary venture to the Areopagus in Athos. The one place in the book of Acts where he attempts to preach to a crowd who know nothing of the Jewish scriptures and who remain, therefore, totally incomprehending, except for two converts, St. Luke mentions, one of whom is a certain Dionysius the Areopagite, about whom we hear nothing more in the tradition of the church until sometime just after the turn of the 6th century. In the year 532, the Emperor Justinian convoked a mini-council in Constantinople to try and sort out the division that had occurred in the Church in the East over the definition of Christ and the union of God and man in Christ given at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. As you might know, if you've studied a little church history, that council produced a schism which has endured to the present day. With churches like the Church of Egypt, the Copts, the Church of Ethiopia and Armenia, much of Syria, the Indian Church adhering to the anti-Chalcedonian side. And the emperor was trying to stop the schism, bring them together. The convocation failed, but it was a significance in that those on the anti-Chalcedonian side quoted in support of their position against Chalcedon one Dionysius the Areopagite, and quoted from his works, it was in fact Epistle 4 in this corpus, only to be turned down flat by Metropolitan Hypatius, who was presiding for the Chalcedonian side, Ephesus, who said, since we haven't heard of that person outside of the book of Acts, in John Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria and the Cappadocian Fathers and Athanasius and anybody, we will not accept this as a genuine witness. Now, in spite of the good Metropolitan's hesitations, however, in 532, by the end of the 6th century, everybody loved Dionysius the Areopagite. And I mean everybody. Those who were for Chalcedon, those who were against Chalcedon, even the so-called Nestorians in the further Christian East. They all thought he was the cat's pajamas. And what are the works that come to us under that name? Well, there are 3 fair-sized treatises, going in the order which I think the corpus should be written and in which it has been received. ever since the earliest scholia, or commentaries on it, from only about 10 or 20 years after Justinian's colloquium. His earliest commentaries came out from Bishop John's Athos. We have the celestial hierarchy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the divine names, and fourth, there's a very short little treatise, the mystical theology. It's only about 5 or 6 pages in this edition, and then 10 letters. The words hierarchy, the word hierarchy and the expression mystical theology are also, by the way, Dionysius, appear to be Dionysius' own coinage. Whenever you hear the word hierarchy, you hear it pretty often, actually. That's his word. It comes from him. And a lot of the challenge facing me when I decided to take him up in the last year of my seminary studies at St. Vladimirs was to figure out what he meant by that. Now, there are certain other characteristics of this writer which have affected contemporary scholarship. The stuff you'll read about him if you pick up an encyclopedia article, a very good encyclopedia article, as you might have found in the old days in Britannica or something like that. I don't know about Wikipedia, what that does with it. But this contemporary scholarship is shaped by a couple of Germans. It's always Germans. Shortly before the turn of the 20th century, 1895 to be exact, 2 Germans, one named Josef Stiegelmeier and the other one Hugo Koch, who put out simultaneously articles demonstrating the remarkable parallels between the section on evil in Divine Names chapter 4 and the treatise of Proclus Diadochus, a late Neoplatonist philosopher, on the question of evil. In fact, they were often exact word-for-word matches. So from those 2 scholars to the present, it has been generally recognized that this ancient Christian writer, writing under the pseudonym of a convert of St. Paul, was a devotee of the next to the last of the great pagan Neoplatonist philosophers. And the question then of his Christianity likewise arose, or a question mark placed over his Christianity. In fact, that question mark was placed some years earlier, to be exact, at the outset of the Reformation. Martin Luther was singularly unimpressed by Dionysius and remarked, he is plus Platonisans quam Christianisans, more Platonizing than Christianizing, and advised his readers, I think it was on the Babylonian captivity of the church, to avoid like the plague this Dionysius, whoever it was. And that attitude, you could say, pretty much permeates the majority of scholars, certainly in the Reformation tradition, but since the 40s of the last century, particularly even Roman Catholic scholars. And when I was taught Dionysius in my last year at St. Vladimirs, I was taught that he was a villain. Well, he had some good ideas. This apophatic theology, that was a good thing. This is Father John Lang. That was a good thing. But this hierarchy business was obviously a sort of magical clericalism and damaging to the liturgy and the sensus fidelium around of the church, the sense of the church. And so I approached him when I went off to Oxford to do my graduate studies, determined to unmask the villain and address the damage he had done the Orthodox faith over the centuries. And I ran into a difficulty. Well, the first difficulty was I came to Oxford with seminary Greek. So the first time I opened up Dionysius in Greek, I recognized the and but. And everything else was mysterium tremendum. So that took about 2 or 3 years to manage the Greek. And then when I finally had managed it and read him over several times, I couldn't make it work. I couldn't figure it out. It wasn't coherent. Now, here's the problem. And it's a problem noted by other scholars. And it's exactly the problem between his most famous coinages. Hierarchy on the one hand, and mystical theology on the other. The mystical theology is both the title of that little treatise that I mentioned, with the famous scene of Moses ascending into the darkness on Sinai as an image of union with God in the darkness of unknowing. But it's an image, an idea which is repeated at several points in the course of not only that treatise, but the divine names. And very clearly speaks about an immediate person-to-person contact with divinity. So there was that. And on the other hand, there was this business of hierarchy, which of course, well, we understand nowadays, our common or garden variety American English usage of the term refers essentially to pecking order, yes, or chain of command. And Dionysius is nothing if not insistent on this. That knowledge percolates from the first ranks of the angels to the second, knowledge of God percolates from the first rank of the angels to the second rank, to the third rank, down to the bishop, to the priests, to the deacons, and then to the faithful. Well, how does one square that with the first? This insistence on mediation with the equal and equally repeated insistence on a direct contact with God. And then finally, what does the whole thing have to do with Jesus? Who is barely mentioned in the mystical theology. In fact, he's only mentioned as part of the Trinity, but that's it. What has this to do with Christ and Him crucified? So that was my problem. And following all the modern scholarship of the era, this was the 70s, I just couldn't make the damn thing fit together. I tried sitting down and writing it up, and it just wouldn't come. At the same time this frustration was occurring, I was experiencing what the French call a crise de foi, which can mean two things in French. It can mean a liver problem, for which you go drink the waters of Vichy or something, and then also crisis of faith, because it was exactly this problem, this matter of everybody, as I said at the beginning. By the end of the 6th century AD, everybody thought he was the cat's pajamas. He is universally admired. He is commentated on him admiringly within, as I said, a generation of his first mention. He's translated into Syriac probably around the same time Justinian is calling his convocation. And he's a hit there, as far away as Iraq and Persia, where Babai the Great is commenting on Evagrius with the help of Dionysius. And altogether approvingly, or St. Isaac of Nineveh, 150 years later, is quoting him admiringly in Iraqi Kurdistan. At the same time as he's being copied in Constantinople and sent in copy to Anastasius the librarian in Rome. So they all think he's terrific, and that included everybody after. Maximus Confessor, writing the most brilliant theologian in later Byzantine history. Writing his wonderful little treatise, the Mystagogy, begins it by saying, I'm just going to say a few things that the great Dionysius left unsaid or not clearly expressed. Now, if you read modern scholars, most of them will say, well, Maximus is making it up. He's creating a hole in cloth. But in fact, I think he's right. That will be another story. John Damascene quotes Dionysius for his definition of Trinitarian perichoresis, and he's the first one to use the word. The circumcessio, or co-indwelling of the Holy Trinity, is first stated, you could say, explicitly in the Dionysian corpus. And John quotes him all over the place in his summary of the Orthodox faith. Simeon, new theologian, I believe, knows him very well, and certainly his disciple Nikitas Athos in the first part of over the course of the 11th century, is busy quoting him right, left, and center, and assimilating his own master Simeon to the works of the great Areopagite. And the hesychasts from Gregory of Sinai to Gregory Palamas are quoting him like mad. In fact, Gregory's big fight with Barlaam, the last great theological controversy of the Byzantine era, is a battle in greatest part over the interpretation of Dionysius. So I was confronted with this. I mean, the tradition thought he was terrific. And all my learned Germans were saying he's a bum. Well, did that mean then that the tradition was wrong? And there came the crise de foi part. Not with the liberty. If they're right, then the tradition's wrong. And how could it be so wrong as to adopt a Platonizing fraud who couldn't even manage a coherent thesis? So I was suddenly in a kind of desert. And it was at that point, unable to write anything, floundering in my own maintenance of the faith, that I went to then Father Callistos and said, can I get to Greece somehow? I want to go to Mount Athos and find a holy man. And I wanted to find a holy man because I wanted to find some assurance that all the pretty words that I'd been taken with since seminary had some echo or answer in actual life. That it wasn't just a pretty word or the beauties of the liturgy, which I always loved, been brought up with, shaking. But if this was so much pretty nonsense, or did it have an actual incarnation? So Callistus, of course, who had despaired of me at this point, said, yes, go see old Athenagoras in London, and he's coming to church in a couple of weeks. Talk to him. So I did. And the old man invited me to spend part of Holy Week in his residence in London, near Paddington Station. And I did. At the end of it, he sat me down and said, write a letter to the Metropolitan, I forget, Corinth. They were buddies. He was head of the scholarship committee for the Greek Church. So I plugged into the Greek Old Boys Network. And sure enough, got my scholarship to Greece and went off to live for a year in Thessaloniki and make as many trips to Mount Athos, it being very close to the second city of Greece, as many trips as I could. And that brings me to Father Emilianos and Simonos Petras. I said I went off in search of a holy man, and I found one. But not at first. First time I saw Emilianos and Simonos Petras, I thought, another dumpy little Greek. And he was holding his hand out to be kissed, and I thought, oh, craps, another Levantine paterfamilias. I'd cooled my heels in a number of episcopal antechambers by this point, and I wanted no more of it. And of course, I was a child of the Vietnam generation, and like most of my generation, had a suspicion of authority bordering on the pathological. So I had no use for him when I saw him. But the monastery impressed me. You know, coming from the Russian background, we're used to pretty services. Pretty singing, especially pretty singing. And Athos in the late 70s was a musical desert. You'd go to one of those glorious old monasteries with the frescoes from the 15th, 16th century, dripping with gold and silver and precious stones, and the service would sound like this. For hours and hours. But at this monastery, it was glorious. Byzantine chant, two choirs going back and forth at each other. The service is celebrated with elegance and briskly. Again, in Athos at the time, over the centuries, the different monks in their generations had added pietistic things, a sort of paraclesis to whoever, and another canon to some other saint, so that the daily service is kind of stretched. And I was told later that when Emilianos and his young monks came from Meteora, the first thing he said was, the services will be by the book, and only what's in the book. The typical, the orologia. So brisk and splendid, and the young monks were cheerful, slender and sane, and pretty articulate. I was beginning to learn enough Greek to converse. So I went back several times in that first year, and in the course of my acquaintance with them, I began to know him. And my initial negative impression shifted to one of increasing admiration because I watched the way he dealt with his monks. And at the end of that year, I had to make a decision whether to give up my my doctoral pursuit and go back and be ordained a deacon by the old bishop who had ordained my father a deacon, Shavskoy, San Francisco, or to soldier on. Now, I was hoping to be, I went to Simonos to ask his blessing, and I was hoping to get it so I could be done with this tiresome scholarly pursuit and do something real. And he said instead, oh no, he said, if you don't finish it, you'll be haunted the rest of your life. You'll never finish it if you give up. So tell you what, he told me. You come here for a year. You live here. It'll be your obedience to work on your dissertation. And if you need anything, just ask. Paper, typewriter, shoes, pants, socks. Ask. But you have to ask. So, I did. I went off to Oxford for the summer to earn a little money teaching English, and came back the following fall, and began a year at his monastery. A year that would change my life. Now, approaching our ancient author. I hadn't made any progress in that first year in Greece. I had simply been collecting impressions. There was one impression, though, as in the first days that I came back, that played an important role. I had arrived, and in those days you used to have to go up to Charis, the capital of Mount Athos, to get your passport for the Holy Mountain. And usually the bus only ran in one direction. You had to wait till the next morning to catch it back down to the other side, where Simonos Petras was. So I had to spend the night on the far side, in Charis, and I hooked up with a couple of young French-Canadian physicians, devout young Catholics, who had come to Athos on pilgrimage, like quite a few European Catholics come, maybe especially from Germany. And we went down to Iviron together. And it was Saturday night, and I asked the father when we got to the guest house to wake me up for the matins and liturgy on Sunday morning. And the young man said to me, oh, could we go with you? I said, it's going to be 4 or 5 hours. Are you sure you want to get up and do that? I said, oh, yes. Okay. So we did. It was 4 or 5 hours, and that of that 4 or 5 hours. And I'm wondering throughout, and figures come in and out of doors, and curtains open and close, and monks go around lighting candles, and then going around snuffing them out, and light them again, and snuffing them out again. And I was wondering, what on earth? And as we were walking back to catch the bus, I asked them, what did you make of it? Oh, it's funny. They have a great sense of the mystery. That's a good answer. But that answer kind of stuck somewhere in the back brain and percolated. A great sense of the mystery. The mystery, of course, which is the divine presence at the altar. And as I lived in the monastery, shaped by Emilianos, that little intuition, as it were, in the back brain, gotten from my nice young Quebecer, began to prickle. Because as I experienced the life there, more and more the rhythm, the sort of pulse of the monastery became clear. The rhythm of the cell. This abbot was attempting something quite special, although it had precedence in people like St. Basil Leszkowski, who we greatly admired, among others. And that was that it sought to combine the life of the hermit and the life of the common, of the monastery of common life. So the young monks were all keeping vigil in themselves. I tried to do it a little tiny. So you begin your monastic day in the dark of the wee hours, in concentrated repetition of the name of Christ, Jesus' prayer, and prostrations. And you conclude your wee hour vigil with the offices of the church in matins, and then finally the revelation of the divine liturgy and Holy Communion. So the whole life of the vigil of the monk, as it were, flows into the altar. And as you know, in Orthodox monasteries, traditionally the church is at the center of the monastery square. Everything kind of moves into the altar. And likewise then, from the altar, the life of the brotherhood flows into its various duties and services. So there was this to and fro, into the altar and from the altar. And I think what was happening inside me was a kind of realization, unspoken, unrealized, unconscious still, that this to and fro, this ebb and flow, was related to two terms which were very important for Dionysius, as they were for the late Neoplatonists. The terms procession and return. Proolos and epistrophe, which is a sort of construction of the universe that St. Thomas Aquinas takes up for the shaping of his Summa, the exodus reditus of creation, flowing from and back to God. But here, flowing into the altar and flowing from it. And slowly the realization grew that this indeed was what was happening in Dionysius. And as with Dionysius, in Emilianos I had the image and the reality of the holy man. And came increasingly to see that that was the function, as it were, of the Dionysian corpus. Now we'll go into this, I'll unpack that a little bit. And we'll go into this word hierarchy, which, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, we normally take in our contemporary English as pecking order or chain of command. But that's not really what it means for Dennis. Call him by its French way, yes? Denis. in Celestial Hierarchy, chapter 1, and maybe the most important paragraph in the whole corpus, he in fact sets out his definition of hierarchy. It would not be possible, he says, for the human intellect to be ordered to that immaterial imitation of the heavenly minds, meaning the angels, unless it were to use the material guide that is proper to it, reckoning the visible beauties as reflections of the invisible splendor, the perceptible fragrances as impressions of the intelligible distributions, the material lights an icon of the immaterial gift of light, the sacred and extensive teaching of the scriptures an image of the intellect's intelligible fulfillment, the exterior ranks of the clergy, that is hierarchy itself, Bishop, an image, an icon, of the harmonious and ordered state of the intellect which is set in order for divine things, and our partaking of the most divine Eucharist, an image of our participation in Jesus. Now, what is that? Well, he's clearly talking about the liturgy, right? The material, the perceptible fragrances, the incense, perfumes, the material lights, the candles, the specific mention of the Eucharist, and the ordered ranks of the clergy. But this is divinely given image of the human being, set in order for divine things. And in fact, 2 chapters later, he goes on to say that the celebrants of the hierarchy are shaped by it, stamped by it, apotypo, the word is the verb he uses, impressed by it. And indeed, we can probably most simply translate this word hierarchy in him as liturgy. Ordered worship, whether the ordered worship of heaven, the angels, or of earth, the church. So, the liturgy as shaping and indeed providing the image, providing the image of the deified human being, and indeed contributing to the shaping of the deified human being. And indeed, I found that same idea, as it turned out, some years later, expressed in so many words over 100 years before Dionysius. In the works of Saint Macarius, the writer whom we know as Saint Macarius the Great. I don't know if you've heard of the Macarian homilies. There are several sets, actually. There's the collection of 50 is translated in English in the same series as this Dionysius book, the Apollos Press, one with a much better cover, much more traditional cover. A nice icon, a nice icon on the cover of St. Macarius' monk. Except they weren't by St. Macarius, who was an Egyptian. They're by an unknown Syrian, writing sometime at the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century, who was suspected by some of his bishops as a heretic. He wasn't. But the suspicion could get your works trashed. So the monks kept him. They liked him. And they kept him under the untouchable name of Macarius, just like Evagrius was preserved in great part under the name of Milos of Angers, among others. Well, in one of the Macarian homilies, we'll call him Macarius since we don't know his name, this saint, over 100 years before Dionysius, writes, "Because visible things are the type and shadow of hidden ones, and the visible temple, a type of the temple of the heart, and the priest, a type of the true priest of the grace of Christ, and all the rest of the sequence of the visible arrangement," meaning the visible worship, the church's worship, "a type of the rational and hidden manners of the inner man, we receive the visible arrangement and administration of the church at worship as a pattern of what is at work in the soul by grace." So exactly what we see in Dionysius Celestial Hierarchy 1.3 we find in the Macarian homilies, in the Syrian Christian writer writing in Greek over 100 years before, and in fact one finds exactly the same sentiment expressed in Syriac, probably still earlier, in a book called the Reappraising, written somewhere in Iraqi Kurdistan, like Isaac Wood, a couple 100 years later. So this is a notion, what Dionysius calls hierarchy, that's coming right out of the ascetical and mystical tradition of the Syrian Christian East. And Dionysius himself, it's generally agreed, must have hailed from Syria, or maybe Palestine, Syria, Palestine. Now, what does this then have to do with the mystical theology? The problem that I outlined earlier. Well, in fact, if you take hierarchy as liturgy, and the whole progress of the human, as the image of the human being sanctified, then the church comes also to serve as the image and reality of the divine presence, indeed of the divine mountain. And this is again, by the way, a notion which goes back not only well before Dionysius in the Christian tradition in Syria. We find it in Ephraim, St. Ephraim, in the wonderful, maybe what is St. Ephraim's chef d'oeuvre, his hymns on paradise, which Sebastian Brock translated for St. Vladimir Seminary Press and wrote a wonderful introduction to. But St. Ephraim, in talking about paradise, the Garden of Eden, is working with a set of about 4 or 5 parallels. There's Eden, which is presented as a mountain. And the idea is not unique with Ephraim. In fact, it goes back to Ezekiel, chapter 28. It speaks of Eden as mountain. And the Paradise Mountain is set in parallel with Sinai, with the temple in Jerusalem, with the Christian church, with the Christian. So that the tree of life answers to the peak of Sinai, answers to the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple, answers to the altar of the Christian church, answers to the innermost of the Christian heart. Holy of Holies with each of us. And if we take this model and impose it on Dionysius' picture of Moses ascending Sinai in mystical theology, we have, as it were, a kind of progressus, introit into the altar, to the peak of the mountain, to the encounter with God. and indeed right in the middle of the treatise devoted to the Church. Dionysius concludes that the first half of that work with a reference to Jesus, our most divine altar, in whom mystically consumed we have access to God. In whom become whole burnt offerings, we have our access to the Father. Whole burnt offering, mystically consumed, mystikos holokauton. Wholly consumed, I would take as answering to Moses, going beyond knowledge, going beyond the unknowing and unknowing in the darkness of the divine presence, sort of melting, as it were, in order to become wholly present to the presence of God. So, a correspondence between Sinai and the altar of the Church. The whole of it, as it were, summed up and aimed at the production of the man of God, the fully realized Christian. I was to find out much later that that was indeed very much Father Dionysius' thinking, and why he so stressed the liturgy as the culmination of the monk's vigil, because it is the vision of God and the encounter with God. It is, as one of my graduate students, Father Roger Miller, his wife was brought into the church, and she told me the first time she walked into an Orthodox church, she looked around and said, "Oh, apocalypse." The revelation, the presence of the kingdom come, and the presence that answers to what we are discover within, which is the thrust indeed of the hesychasts, going back all the way to St. Evagrius Pontificus. I suppose I'm not supposed to call him the same. Evagrius was officially a heretic. You've heard of him? Evagrius? Is that a strange name? Vivagrius. Well, this is the great genius of the Eastern ascetical tradition, right at the end of the 4th century. He and Macarius, or the guy who we know of, Macarius, those two together are kind of the great twins. I won't go into why they call him a heretic. They might have been partly correct, but I will recall to you an experience of mine, an anecdote. While I was at the monastery, the youngest monk was a young man named Yosaf. He's a very gruff young fellow from Kalambaka. And I was out taking the air the evening before retiring to the cell for the night. And he was sweeping the stables below. He looks up at me. He says, "Alexander!" He talked like that. "Alexander!" And I said, "Yes, Father Joseph." "You read Evagrius?" "Yes, Father." "They say he's a heretic." I said, "Yes, they do, Father." "Well, but he was also a saint." And I said, "Yes." And so the Christian is temple as the realization of divine presence, shaped as such by the liturgy. That is the thrust of the Dionysian corpus, and that is how you will see him interpreted and read in every generation of monastic writers after the appearance of the Areopagite. So I took that reading as the correct one, and that's what I published. And if you want to buy a book, there it is. paperback even. Cistercian press. Put out by college. I get royalties. They're not very much, but it's not. You can't go to be a real. But you might pick it up if you're interested in interesting scholarship. That is my Dionysius, and I think the Dionysius of the Church. And I arrived at him to be a contemporary holy man of Mount Athos. And that perspective has shaped my own reading and my own life to the present day. And there, having had you now for about 15 minutes, I will conclude. And you may ask questions.
I liked your the delineation of the progression from the heavens to the Mount of Sinai, the temple, altar.
That's St. Ephraim. You'll see that laid out in Sebastian Bach's introduction to the Paradise. In fact, I remember vividly the moment I read that, I was in my office at Marquette.
So I was thinking about also the connection you were making with the Mystikon Kafton, the holy offering.
Yes.
That you were making some other scriptural references, and what came to mind immediately to me, and I'm just trying to just ask a question about how everything is connected in our faith with Scripture too. That David says this in Psalm 51, well, Psalm 50 in the Septuagint.
Over offerings. In fact, what I thought you were going to say, I thought you were going to point to two possible scriptural passages. The first being Elijah on Mount Carmel, and the fire from heaven licking up the water and the slaughtered bulls. But even more opposite, the fire of heaven that comes down and consumes the sacrifice in Leviticus 9, the sacrifice which consecrates the tabernacle. Establishes. Because that fire, that passage in Leviticus, is one that occurs throughout the ascetical literature, especially of Syria, in the Syriac language tradition, joined both to the moment of the anaphora, the epiclesis of the anaphora, and to the visitation of the Holy Spirit within. That fire from heaven.
So it is about the way we live our faith, but I ran into someone that I hadn't seen in 20 years on Sunday, of all times, the supermarket of all places, who had departed from the church and is now claims to go to the Tabernacle Baptist Church. I'm not familiar with that church. I said, well, why? And I got the same standard answer I do get from many fellow Orthodox who fall away or drift away, that we don't understand our Bible, we don't adhere to Scripture as well. And I'm just thinking about these scriptural connections that you were making, that the fathers also made, and then the practice of our liturgical worship.
There is nobody more biblical than Dionysius, in fact, mentions this passage that I'm going to cite in Redefining. He talks about the hierarchy of the law. Well, what does it mean? It means the liturgy. It means the liturgy of the temple.
The function.
And tabernacle. Oh, the worship. And that's important for me. And we have in there an allusion to one of the most important passages in the five books of Moses. It occurs in chapter 25 of Exodus. This is, by the way, the part of Exodus where if you set out, as I did as a freshman in college,
to read the Bible through. You know, and away we go, and Genesis just kind of swims along with all the stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and this and that, and then there's Exodus, and we've got Pharaoh and the plagues, and the Red Sea, and the wanderings in the desert, and it's all story, and all of a sudden you hit a wall. Oh, wow! Where it's all about cubits and kinds of yarn, and flowers, and this goes on and on and on and on. And you say, oh, right, and the interesting thing is that you pick up most introductions to the Old Testament, written by the Germans, other good Germans, they have the same attitude. That's it. Priesterschaft, Covenant, such and forth. Yeah, but this stuff, nine. But in fact, on the contrary, if you look at the ancient rabbis and at the ancient church fathers, they can't get enough of this. And they reoccur again and again and again. Like Gregor Nyssa devotes half of his life in Moses to those very chapters in Exodus that are a wall. Yes? The cubits and things. Half of the life of Moses. And in the ascetical literature, the images from those chapters reoccur. Why? Because that whole excruciatingly dull section begins with God saying to Moses up on the mountain. This is when Moses is up there for 40 days and 40 nights. Yes? Ever seen pictures of Mount Sinai? What's there?
Monasteries.
Huh?
It's a monastery.
On top, what's there? Walk. Just walk. There isn't a damn bush. There is nothing. So the question arose in ancient times, well, before Christ, what do you eat for 40 days and 40 nights? And the rabbis answered, he fed on the light of the Shekinah. He fed on the light of the divine presence. Which in fact we find echoed in Macarius again. He knows that tradition. And it might even be behind Christ's words about the bread from heaven in the Gospel of John. But anyhow, when he's up there, so it's a very important moment. So what's he doing for those 40 days and 40 nights? Well, God begins by saying to him, I want to dwell with my people, so I want you to make me a sanctuary for me to dwell with. And you will make it exactly according to the pattern that I show you. And the question, of course, is, what's the pattern? What does he mean by pattern? We think, of course, of, like God shows him a blueprint. Here it is. But that's not what the ancients thought. By no later than 200 years before Christ, as we can see in the First Enoch and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was the belief of Jewry that God showed Moses the temple in heaven. Took him to heaven and showed him the heavenly original which he was to copy on earth. On earth as it is in heaven. Yes, that applies to the worship of Israel. And so when Ezekiel portrays his angels, a number of them is dressed in white linen, that's the vestment of the priest. The angels are priests, celebrating the heavenly in the heavenly liturgy. That idea comes from Israel to us. It's the basis for the whole of the Epistle to the Hebrews. The whole epistle is built on that idea. And it's, you could say, it's fundamentally at work in our worship. In point after point, one can indicate the roots of what we do in church in the Israel of the Revelation. It's those poor souls, in the Baptist tabernacles who don't remember that.
I wish I could take you to save this out of this.
Right. Don't have that. And that was, in fact, one of the reasons for my excitement in discovering the Syrians, was that there was this so obvious connection between the very heart of our ascetical and mystical tradition, the notion of Theosis, the beginnings of our Christology, our understanding of who Jesus is, and the Church, in the texts of Israel and the ambient of the late Second Temple, which is, of course, the very ambient from which the faith in Christ crystallizes and comes thence to us. All these things have continuities going back to the beginnings of the Revelation. Yes?
After your own experience with both the Syrian Father and the Germans and others, well, how do you now reflect on the usefulness of various historiographical schools and traditions to understanding Christian writers and more especially mystical writers?
Such as?
Dionysius, or pseudo-Dionysius.
The usefulness
of using different schools of historiography. First, in this case, of using the Germans, or of using the Reformation scholars, or of using the Syrian fathers, or more generally, how do you take that?
So what's the use of scholarship, in a way?
Or different schools? Because it sounds like you had to stumble through some different schools of
Well,
scholarship.
yes, I think to find my own place, yes, and the place from which I would read things. And that place is really Emilianos. In a way, he is my lens through which I read the ancient writers.
The person.
My contemporary holy man through whom I understand the ancient saints. But what use are these, all those Germans?
Mm-hmm.
A lot. Now, the thing about, there was a great sort of galaxy of German scholars in the late 19th, early 20th century who were all obsessed with one great idea or another. It was always the great idea, to which the different facts would have to be marshaled and march in demonstration, whether the Hellenization of the Gospel of Otto von Harnack or some Hegelian schema of, say, Wellhausen or the Old Testament. And the great idea is almost always cockamamie, and you can ignore it. But the detail, because they read everything. And they weren't, of course, burdened by the 5 or 6 generations of secondary literature that's been piled on top of them. So they read the primary sources from A to Z. And you can find stuff in there that still is useful. I got several articles reading von Reitzenstein's account of the earliest monks. And, his perspective was cockamamie. But he had the details. And from the details, you could call a great deal and see things. So they are useful. Now, if we get into stuff like New Testament
criticism. I have to admit I have a lot of problem. Because there the problem of secondary literature is immense. And given that, the New Testament scholarship was confined for so many generations to that little body of work, it's only about that big. And you have 7 or 8 generations of PhD scholars looking to say something original about something that big. So you get piles on piles and piles and piles. And it's suffocating. The people I think to read nowadays are people working in something like Christian Origins or Second Temple, because they can read a much wider perspective, and they can actually say something useful about the New Testament. They aren't inhibited by all the other secondary literature around them that cramps it. Would be hopelessly cramped. So, some of it can be very good. There's a whole troop of people, some Christian, some Jew, some neither, who write about, there was a section in Society of Biblical Literature, which was a kind of smorgasbord. It still is, That's so big is the field, and so immense the secondary literature that now is kind of divvied up into little sort of boutiques, yes? And you go to the boutique that, you find sympathique. And there was one I would go to called Early Jewish and Christian Mysticism, Early Christian and Jewish Mysticism. But what it was doing was sort of taking from, I think, a fundamental lead from Gershom Scholem, who was a great scholar of Jewish mysticism, wrote major trends in Jewish mysticism in the early 40s. And his question was, what's the connection between the literature of the apocalypses in the late second, like Daniel in the Old Testament, or Revelation in the New, and medieval Kabbalah. In the Jewish circles of Spain and Rhineland, Germany. And he found a connection, he thought, in some texts that were medieval, but he argued were much, much earlier, like time of Talmud, the Mishnah Talmud. And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which came 5 or 6 years after he published Major Trends, revealed a great deal of literature which appeared to uphold his thesis. I can go into more detail on that some other time, perhaps. Which appeared to uphold his thesis, and then that in turn leads a number of people, starting, I think, with some in Holland, Eric Peterson, Gilles Quispel, to say, well, this has applications to early Christianity, and to Gnosticism, and to all kinds of stuff. And I was introduced to this, far down the line, and a new take on apocalyptic literature, where it's not simply literature, but it may have some echo of experience, of actual visionary experience, yes? And by the time I came to it, there were a number of people publishing. I would mention especially Alan Siegel, Christopher Morey Jones, Crispin Fletcher Lewis, just the names of people that I know that come quickly to my memory. I looked at their stuff. Christopher Rowan, The Open Heaven, apocalyptic literature.
I looked at their stuff and I thought, oh my God, here's Macarius, and here's Dionysius, and here's Dionysius. Not quite as they're worked out fully later on, but here are the roots, and it's clearly, we're clearly moving in the same tradition. Currents flowing out of the Second Temple in parallel among Jews and Christians. So there can be wonderful things in God, and exciting things, and there can be just a great pack of rubbish. The point is that you have to figure out where you are and where you read them, where you are when you read them. Your place, as it were. Yes?
Vladika, I heard that fathers recommend not read fathers for knowledge, but read for salvation. So, is that why some of the contemporary opinions were against Dionysius? So, how would you explain that they are not?
Well, in the first place, I think much of the hostility derives from a reading which begins with the Reformation. I quoted Luther, and Luther was picking up a Dionysius who had already been, as it were, through the rinse cycle of the scholastics, already adapted to theology of the medieval West, and kind of adulterated, and taken in part. It wasn't the whole Dionysius that, say, an Aquinas admired and incorporated the Sumo, or a Meister Eckhart echoed in on apophatic theology, or a John of the Cross. But it was always a kind of selected Dionysius. And when Luther comes to it, it's a clear example for him of what he called a theologia gloria. That is an understanding that one can approach God without Christ. The independent intellect. And that was anathema. It's not the theologia crucis, theology of the cross. It's perverse from the get-go. And that affects all the Protestant scholars, more or less to the present. Not the guy who translated this particular English rendering, which is the only commonly available now. The actual translator is very competent, but the man who directed the translator's understanding of the writer is a man named Paul Roram, who was a good Lutheran. Reads Dennis in a very Lutheran way. So your theological perspective to start with is going to shape your reading of them. Even if you're a devout Christian, as Paul Roram I know is, I know him, his particular understanding of Christianity does not allow for this. In fact, it doesn't allow for much of